Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time we're tackling a molecule I've heard called the master of disguise.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It's the sigma-1 receptor, and we're diving into some insights from cocktail party chemistry. Episode 21.
5, to be exact.
5. Okay, so factoid number 1 says that the sigma-1 receptor is like a chameleon.
Modulating both stress and neuroprotection.
Right. So what makes this thing so adaptable?
Well, sigma-1 receptors are proteins you can find all over,
Okay.
but especially in brain cells.
Uh-huh.
What's unique is that they can bind to a bunch of different molecules, which
Wait.
are called ligands.
Ligands. Okay.
And you can almost think about each ligand as like a key fitting into a specific lock on the receptor.
Interesting.
And depending on which key is in there, the receptor's function can change.
So it's almost like sometimes it's helping with stress and sometimes it's protecting brain cells.
Exactly. And it's this adaptability that's really exciting for researchers
I can imagine.
because it suggests it can play all kinds of roles in the body.
So it's a multitasker.
Yeah, so it could do things like how we respond to stress, but also protect us from brain diseases like neurodegenerative diseases.
That is pretty impressive for one little molecule.
It is.
Okay, well, factoid number 2 builds on that and says this ligand diversity unlocks something called selective drug design.
Right.
Can you pack that for us?
Sure. So
La-
because the sigma-1 receptor binds to so many different ligands,
Yeah.
scientists think they can actually design drugs to act like specific keys. So they only target certain receptor functions.
So almost like you could reduce stress without messing with its role in protecting neurons.
Exactly. That's the goal, at least.
Wow.
It's like having a toolkit
Ah,
where you can tweak a function without causing all these other side effects.
no, that would be amazing.
Yeah, it would.
Okay, let's shift gears a little and talk about the brain specifically now.
Okay.
Factoid number 3 says ion channel modulation reveals hidden nerve pathways.
Right.
So what's going on there?
Well, you can think about brain cells or neurons as like these circuits, electrical circuits, and within those circuits are ion channels. They're like little gates controlling the flow of signals.
Right.
The sigma-1 receptor can actually influence those channels.
Really?
So it changes how the neurons talk to each other.
So it's not just sitting there, it's like directing traffic.
Exactly. And by studying that, researchers are finding all these communication pathways that were hidden before.
Wow, like secret routes on a map.
Pretty much.
That could totally change how we think about the brain.
For sure.
But how about keeping those brain cells healthy?
Right.
Factoid 4 is all about neuroprotection and how it helps cells survive.
Yeah, so brain cells are always under attack from things like toxins or stress or just getting older.
Right.
Neuroprotection is all about protecting those cells, and sigma-1 seems to play a big role in that.
Yeah, it's like giving brain cells this armor. So research shows that sigma-1 can protect brain cells from lots of things,
Okay.
like damage from strokes or even those neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. So it's not just about handling stress, it's about making brain cells tougher.
Right.
That's really cool.
Mm.
Are there any studies that show this protective power in action?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay.
One study found that activating the sigma-1 receptor actually made brain cell death way less likely in mice after they had a stroke.
Wow.
And that kind of research is super promising.
Yeah.
It could lead to new ways to prevent or treat some of these really tough conditions.
That's incredible. It sounds like this little molecule could be huge in fighting brain disease.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get into the treatments, let's look at factoid number 5.
Okay.
Therapeutic horizons.
Right.
New treatments for brain disorders.
Lots of fun.
Like what kind of disorders are we talking about here?
Well, scientists are looking at its potential for things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's,
Right.
even addiction.
Wow, that's a lot.
It really seems to be involved in a lot of brain functions.
Yeah.
So the possibilities for treatment are pretty big.
Can you give me an example? Like how could targeting this receptor work in, say, Alzheimer's?
Sure. So imagine if we could make a drug
Okay.
that boosts the sigma-1 receptor's protection,
Yeah.
that could protect brain cells from the damage Alzheimer's causes,
Okay.
and maybe even slow it down or stop it.
That sounds pretty hopeful.
It does.
But you mentioned earlier that the sigma-1 receptor can actually pair with itself.
Right.
It's like there's another layer to this whole thing.
Exactly. We can't forget about that. It's called receptor dimerization.
Okay.
That's where two sigma-1 receptors come together. And that can change the receptor's behavior and how it works.
So they team up.
Yeah, like a dynamic duo.
I like that.
And that can affect how it works in the brain.
How so?
Well, think of it like this. When they join forces, they can either make what they already do stronger
Okay.
or even do totally new things. That makes drug development way more interesting
Yeah.
because we could make drugs that encourage or prevent that teaming up and fine-tune the receptor's activity even more.
So it's like we're not just turning it up or down, we're changing the whole sound.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
That opens up a lot of possibilities for making really specific therapies.
It does.
My brain's kind of full, though.
I bet we've covered a lot.
We have. Maybe we should recap before we get to the research and the future of all this.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's put it all together.
Okay.
So we know that the sigma-1 receptor is this awesome molecule that can change and do all these different things.
Okay.
It handles stress, protects the brain, and even controls how brain cells talk to each other.
Right, and it doesn't always work alone. It can team up with other sigma-1 receptors
Exactly.
through dimerization,
Right.
making it even more complex and adaptable.
You got it.
Oh, yeah. And the whole psychedelics connection,
Right.
that this tiny thing might be involved in, like, altered states of consciousness.
Pretty wild, right?
It's definitely something to explore more, but maybe for now, let's talk about the research.
Yeah, good idea.
And the future of all these sigma-1 therapies.
Sounds good.
What are researchers most excited about right now?
I think one of the biggest things is developing those selective sigma-1 receptor modulators.
Oh, yeah, you mean like those specific keys we talked about?
Exactly.
So we're going from a sledgehammer to a scalpel.
That's a good way to put it.
Less damage.
Right, because that's the key here.
Selectivity.
Selectivity, exactly. It means fewer side effects.
And how are they doing that?
Well, there are a bunch of ways,
So-
like designing molecules that bind to specific spots on the receptor, or even controlling that dimerization.
So we're not just targeting the receptor itself, we're targeting how it works.
Right.
That's amazing. What kinds of conditions are they hoping to treat with all this?
Well, the list keeps growing.
I bet.
But some of the most promising areas are things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's stroke, ALS,
Wow.
even some cancers.
So we're really talking about treating all these different things by targeting one receptor.
It's a possibility, but we have to remember, the research is still going on.
Right.
We don't know everything about the sigma-1 receptor yet.
And how it works in all these conditions.
Exactly.
But the early results must be pretty good if researchers are this excited.
They are. There have been some promising preclinical studies,
Yeah.
showing potential benefits in animals.
Uh-huh.
And some compounds are even moving into clinical trials now.
Oh, wow. So like
Yeah.
testing in people.
Yeah, which is a big step.
That's awesome. It's always cool to see treatments go from the lab to the real world.
It is. But we have to be realistic, too.
Oh, God.
challenge-
What kind of challenges?
Well, one of the biggest is understanding how sigma-1 interacts with all the other stuff in the body.
Right. It's not just floating around by itself.
Exactly. It's all connected.
Like a web.
Yeah. And when you mess with one part of that web,
Yeah.
it can affect everything else.
I see.
So we need to do lots of research and careful clinical trials.
to make sure it's safe and
Yeah.
actually works. So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they remember about the sigma-1 receptor?
I'd say the biggest thing is that it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's not just an on or off switch.
Right.
It's like that chameleon we talked about.
Okay.
It has all these different roles depending on where it is and what it's interacting with.
And that makes it both really hard to study, but also really exciting.
It's hard to develop safe and effective treatments,
Yeah.
but it also means that sigma-1 has the potential to totally change how we treat a bunch of diseases.
Like brain diseases, cancer, mental health.
Exactly.
It's like we found this treasure chest, but we're still figuring out how to open it and use what's inside.
I like that analogy.
The future of all this is wide open.
It is. It'll be really interesting to see what happens next.
Well, this has been a pretty amazing journey.
It has.
We went from the basics of this molecule all the way to the cutting edge.
We did.
And I feel like we've barely scratched the surface.
It really shows you how amazing and complex the molecular world is.
Yes.
Even the tiniest things can make a big difference.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
It was my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for diving deep with us.
Thanks, everyone.
We hope you learned something cool.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time. Keep those brains buzzing.